Now this is one of my favourite tales. Mr. and Mrs. Vinegar, they lived in a vinegar bottle. And one day, as Mr. Vinegar had gone out for a walk, Mrs. Vinegar, she swept their home with such energy and such vigour that she smashed it. And when Mr. Vinegar came back, he looked around and said, "Hey dear, smashed to smithereens. Never mind, Mrs. Vinegar, we shall find ourselves a new home." And he took the only part of their house that had not been made from glass, it was the wooden door, and he set it on his back, and he said, "Follow me, Mrs. Vinegar." And off they went, and they walked and they walked and they walked all day. But not a vinegar bottle did they find, at least not one that they could live in. And by now it was fetching dark, and they happened to be walking through some woods at that time, and this was back in the days when the woods were full of wild creatures. Now, as you can probably imagine, there were things like bears and fierce wolves and wild boars with their great tusks, and Mr. and Mrs. Vinegar, they didn't want to sleep on the forest floor with those. Now Mr. Vinegar, he had an idea. He thought if he took the wooden door he'd been carrying and he set it across some branches high up in the trees, they could sleep up there, well away from those wild creatures. And so that's just what they did. Because they'd been walking all day long, they were very tired, and they managed to fall asleep straight away. But in the middle of the night, right below them, there was this. "Hey, give that to me. No, it's mine. It was my idea to steal it from him. It's me that hit him and took it." Two robbers arguing about the gold that they had stolen, and they were right below Mr. and Mrs. Vinegar. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Vinegar, they were terrified, and they shook and shook, and then that made the door wobble and wobble, and that made them more terrified. They shook some more, and the door wobbled some more until it crashed down. They heard no more from the robbers below them. Mr. and Mrs. Vinegar, they were left dangling from the branches, but they didn't dare climb down until the sun had risen and let its light fall through the leafy branches and lit up that forest floor. And then, when they were sure there were no more robbers, Mr. and Mrs. Vinegar, they climbed down from that tree. But they still had nowhere to live. And Mr. Vinegar, he took the door and set it on his back again, when his wife said, "Look, Mr. Vinegar, look down there." On the floor, where the door had been, where the robbers had fled, they had dropped a gold coin. Mrs. Vinegar said, "Take this, my husband, go to the market and buy us a fine red cow full of milk. Bring her back, or we'll milk her, and then we'll make some cheese. And the next day we'll milk her again, and we'll make some more cheese. And then the next day we'll milk her again, and we'll make some more cheese until we have so much cheese we can sell it at the market, and we can buy the vinegar bottle of our dreams." And so that's just what Mr. Vinegar did. He went off to the market with a gold coin, and he did indeed find a fine red cow full of milk, and he exchanged that gold coin for the cow. She had a collar around her neck and a bell, and Mr. Vinegar, he put a rope through that collar and led the cow off on the way back to his wife. Now it was rather a long way, and I don't know if you've ever tried to have a conversation with a cow, but they're not that good company. And Mr. Vinegar, he was starting to get a bit bored leading this cow along the way. But then he saw a man coming the other way who had no worries about being bored, because this man was a piper, and he was playing a fine set of bagpipes, playing a merry tune. He had a whole bunch of children behind him laughing and dancing along. I think they'd just come from a place called Hamlin. And Mr. Vinegar, he saw the pipes and he thought, "I could do with a set of bagpipes like that to pass the time." And the piper, he heard this. He said, "You give me that fine cow of yours, you could have these bagpipes." "Done," said Mr. Vinegar, and he swapped the cow for the bagpipes. Now Mr. Vinegar, he'd never learned to play bagpipes, nor any other instrument for that matter. So when he tried squeezing the bag, it was a terrible racket that came out, screeching, and the children, instead of dancing along merrily, they just pointed at him and laughed, and then they wandered off. But Mr. Vinegar, he kept trying. Eventually it worked out. He needed to cover the holes on the chanter. But it was getting a bit late in the day now. It was getting cold. His fingers, they didn't really cover the holes very well. But here was a man who had no worries about cold fingers. Walking the other way was a man with fine leather gloves. And Mr. Vinegar saw those gloves and he thought, "I could do with a set of gloves like that." "Ah," said the man with the gloves. "I tell you what, you give me those bagpipes, you can have these gloves." "Done," said Mr. Vinegar. And he swapped the bagpipes for the gloves. And he pulled them on, and they were a really comfortable, pleasant fit. but he still had to get back to his wife. He kept walking a bit further, and as he was walking, well, it was such a long way, his back began to ache. But here was a man coming towards him along the path who had no more worries about an aching back, because he was striding along with a proper sort of stick in his hand. And Mr. Vinegar saw that stick, and he thought, I could do with a stick like that. Well, said the man with the stick, I tell you what, you give me those fine leather gloves, you can have this stick. Done, said Mr. Vinegar, and he swapped the gloves for the stick. And then with that, he could stride along, and he felt a lot better for it. Until he heard some laughter up in the tree, and he looked up to see what was laughing at him, and there it was, a magpie, and the magpie said this, Hey, you daft old beggar, you've got no gold now, no cow, no bagpipes, not a glove, all you've got is a stick, and look around you, you're in some woods, it's full of sticks. Well, the magpie, it so angered and vexed Mr. Vinegar, he threw his stick, but the stick stayed stuck. The magpie just flew to another branch and said, And now, where's your stick? And Mr. Vinegar, he had to continue on the rest of the way to his wife, and when he got there, he did indeed have no gold, no cow, no bagpipes, no gloves, not even a stick. But Mrs. Vinegar, she gave him some stick. She gave him some stick, and no mistake. And if they've not found a vinegar bottle, they'll be wondering yet.